Welcome back. The city has put forth several plans they say will solve the NYCHA crisis. PACT and the Blueprint for Change seeks to convert the entire public housing portfolio into private management by 2028. But many NYCHA residents have continued to rally against these plans and propose alternatives to fixing public housing in the city. Joining us now to discuss is Ramona Ferreyra, NYCHA resident and organizer of tenant initiative Save Section 9. Welcome, Ramona. Always nice seeing you.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Claro. So to start, can you tell us about Save Section 9 and your mission?
So Save Section 9 is a collaboration between a few organizations and tenants from public housing. So we include Sunrise NYC, the Movement School, which came out of the AOC campaign, Justice for All out of Queens, and CAV is an organization that organizes Asian tenants in public housing. So we decided to start talking about this from the perspective of saving Section 9 and not saving NYCHA, because what we are passionate about is Section 9 funding, not specifically NYCHA as a management company.
Got you. And if we can actually define, the difference between Section 8 and Section 9 in public housing, can you help us walk through that?
So this is actually something that goes back to the 1980s and is directly linked to racism. So when Reagan was running for president, he decided to cut back on funding to Section 9, which represents public housing all across America. So at this point, we have about 500,000 units of public housing spread out throughout the USA. Since the 80s, the story of the welfare queen, assumptions that Black and brown people that lived in public housing were just lazy and were, mooching off the system and taking advantage, convinced, Republicans to cut back the funding to Section 9 and instead start supporting private developers or private management companies through Section 8. So traditional Section 8 gives a family a voucher, and the family goes around knocking and trying to find an apartment, and they have a certain amount of their rent paid. Section 9 comes directly from Congress to public housing authorities. And it's the same discount program, which is why we argue that instead of, supporting Section 8, which is more expensive than Section 9, that Congress should return funding to what it used to be on the Section 9 side.
So let's elaborate on that privatization of NYCHA. Before we get into any specifics, why are so many residents against privatization? How does this put Section 9 at risk?
So for us, we feel that it is a strategic decision, right, for Congress and HUD to not support housing that primarily serves people of color. And Section 9 is something that we believe can be funded at the right levels to make sure that all of our public housing across the US is, preserved. Section 8, as it's being used by public housing in many different authorities, and including in NYCHA, what they do is they issue tenant protection vouchers. And it's really important for folks to understand that that Section 8 voucher is attached to your apartment, not to you and your family. So you can't get some paper, from NYCHA that says, I have Section 8. Your apartment is receiving the funding. And the reason that NYCHA wants to do this is because specifically in the blueprint, they can then take the money coming from the government and invest that, because these private banks, which are going to back the blueprint and be members of the trust, they are interested in doubling that money as quickly as possible. So Section 8 takes away a lot of the rights that tenants currently have. So we have a right to organize and to ask questions regarding the management of our development. And we're protected to do that. If you're renting from a private, management company, you don't have the right to go to them and ask them for some sort of explanation as to what is happening in your apartment and in your building, unless you own, in a co-op or a condo.
Speaking of organizing, as a social entrepreneur, you actually organize in your current housing development. If you can share which housing development that is, and what are some of the challenges that you and other residents face, especially during the pandemic?
Yeah, so, recently there was a story published proving that NYCHA chose to ignore warnings regarding our ventilation system. And Mitchell Houses, where I am here in the South Bronx, it's been placed in the top 10 developments when it came to infection rates and death of people suffering from COVID. So at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, I tried to, as much as possible, support tenants in getting face masks. So we had gathered face masks and we gave out face masks to our entire development. And we also tried to educate folks about the dangers of the blueprint, because the blueprint was announced last year to us, right? So in the summer, when we're just catching a break and COVID has finally calmed down, and so many of our families, friends and neighbors had passed away, we had to launch a campaign last August to fight the blueprint through education and tenant engagement.
And if you can just, guide us through, what the blueprint is. So as we read, the New York Housing Authority's website describes the blueprint for change as a set of ideas that evaluate where to invest capital toward renovations of NYCHA properties. But, residents like yourself say that the blueprint means an end to public housing. Can you just share more about this and where the blueprint currently stands in Albany?
So the reason why we say that it's going to kill public housing in New York City is because, according to the congressional definition for public housing, you must be in Section 9 in order to be considered public housing. And that's key, right? Because as Greg Russ and NYCHA officials are walking around telling us that public housing will remain public here in New York because NYCHA will maintain the management of the operations day to day, that in itself does not meet the definition required by Congress and HUD. So the minute that we shift our funding stream from Section 9 to Section 8, you're no longer considered public housing. Now, the blueprint in December had a hearing and many people participated, and every tenant and the chair of Citywide Councils of Presidents, Danny Barber, we expressed that we were not going to accept any plan that moved us out of Section 9. And we especially don't want to move into a plan that is not Section 9 and have NYCHA manage us, because NYCHA has demonstrated time and time again that they don't have the capacity to manage public housing. So in December, we were able to kill the bill, and it was pulled and not presented in Albany for actual voting, right? So it didn't go through committees in Albany. Then this spring, at the end of the legislative calendar, a week before, they asked two senators, Senator Kavanaugh and Representative Simbowitz, to reintroduce the bill with some changes that they thought were going to appease elected officials, but did not appease us, the tenants. And the main change that they made was that they treated this like a pilot program. So instead of doing 120,000 units, they wanted to start with 25,000. And there's a danger in that, because having that pilot is exactly how they started RAD and PACT. And if folks are starting to pay attention to the number of units that we're losing, a real good way to measure how much public housing we've lost in New York is that when you looked at news articles or anyone talked about public housing, they always said, we have 600,000 people living in public housing. This was the quote. If we look at the quotes now, it's 400,000. So that means that in the last year, under Greg Russ's leadership, we've lost 200,000 units.
To RAD PACT, correct?
To RAD and PACT.
Got you. And just to explain to our viewers, RAD PACT is a program which takes private dollars to, fix previously NYCHA managed residences. So NYCHA still owns the building, but they don't manage it, correct, Ramona?
Yes. So a private management company is given a lease for 99 years. And it's also important for us to take note that is 99 years, which is to us de facto privatization, because none of us is going to be here in 99 years, and none of us is going to be able to advocate that whatever buildings have been turned into RAD or PACT be returned to Section 9. There's also no path back to Section 9. So Betances houses here in the South Bronx converted to RAD and PACT. There is no process or system established in the legislation that put RAD and PACT forward for Betances or any other development to say, you know what, this isn't working for us. We don't want this management company. We want to go back to Section 9. So once you take it, you're stuck in this limbo of being managed by a private developer and then also losing all of the federal rights that you had guaranteed under Section 9. And 964 specifically, which is the one that supports tenants and education, supposed to do outreach, provide resources, and help us actually move out of public housing and into the middle income families, right? So that is something that folks aren't being told, right? Like if you choose this program and something goes wrong with your manager and you're RAD or PACT, you can call your management and then you're going to have to call NYCHA, and NYCHA will act like you no longer exist. The blueprint is more dangerous because the blueprint takes the funding that our tax dollars are basically supporting and gives it to the stock market in order to be able to produce additional wealth for members of the trust.
So, Ramona, question: if RAD and PACT isn't the solution and the blueprint is out of question, what is the most ideal solution that puts NYCHA residents first?
So the easiest solution is that our congressional representatives start funding Section 9. It's literally moving the budget so that it supports public housing instead of enriching private management companies. The second solution would be for us to explore the ways that NYCHA is mismanaging its funding and also not creating revenue streams. So recently we saw that NYCHA is not using its retail spaces. We have hundreds of thousands of square feet available that could be rented, that could be used, that could be producing income. And then finally, I would say the legislation that's being introduced by Maxine Wright, by Nydia Velázquez, and Chuck Schumer addresses the financial needs of NYCHA. What I find most interesting, though, is that once they pulled the legislation this June, they said that if they do get the funding from Congress and Senate, once that $40 billion comes in, they still want to pursue RAD, PACT, and the blueprint. And there is no need to do that, right? So that's a question that I think every NYCHA tenant needs to be asking themselves is, why is it that Chuck Schumer is visiting multiple developments in New York City, going out and talking to tenants, hearing from tenants that we don't want the blueprint, RAD, or PACT, but NYCHA is not next to him as he does this, right? If NYCHA truly needed the funding, they would be out there.
Right. That's very interesting. I wasn't aware that that was still going to happen. And I know that Chuck Schumer, Senator Chuck Schumer, and U.S. Representative Nydia Velázquez are asking for double the amount. So they're asking for $80 billion for public housing. And that's what you need, right? That's what NYCHA residents need. Before we go, Ramona, thank you so much for your time. How can people learn more about Safe Section 9 and, stay informed? There's so much going on when it comes to public housing at this time.
Yeah, definitely. So we want folks to communicate with their elected officials, let them know that you do not want to be moved from Section 9. And we want folks to start using Save Section 9 as a resource. So on our Facebook group, we have guides and toolkits that you can actually download and figure out how to participate in the campaign. We're regularly tweeting. So through me, Ramona the Mona, on either Instagram or on Twitter, you'll be able to see some of the tweets that will inform you. And finally, we ask that if any tenant is interested in having us at a teach-in or having us come out to Family Day and table, that's something that we're making available to them as well.
Sure. Thank you. Gracias, Ramona. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
We'll be right back here on Open BXRX Tuesday.